So this morning I'm going to be talking about consciousness and the dying brain, and it's an interesting subject in particular because of the near-death experience. And unfortunately, Dr. Parnia can't be with us today, so I wanted to just give you a brief background in terms of the phenomenology and the epidemiology of the near-death experience. So very characteristic reports of individuals who have had near-death experience in terms of the phenomenology relate to an awareness of being dead, but despite that awareness, a feeling of peace. They're very often out-of-body sensations, a sensation of floating or drifting through a tunnel, awareness of a golden light, communicating with a presence, communicating with that light, or communicating with deceased relatives. And this is usually a very positive experience. The world that is experienced is one of profound beauty. And there can often be life recall. We've heard of life flashing before your eyes, but this is like a compressed replay of all of life's events. The memories of these experiences can be indelible, and the experiences themselves can often be transformative. And interestingly, the phenomenology is relatively invariant across cultures. So you see some subtle differences, but not major distinctions in terms of the report. So how often do these experiences happen? Well, it's difficult to study, obviously, if somebody is drowning or if somebody has a cardiac arrest outside of a hospital, but it has been studied in a systematic prospective fashion with patients who have had cardiac arrest in hospitals. So there were two major prospective studies. They were both published in 2001. The first was by Pim van Lommel. He's a cardiologist, as well as Sam Parnia, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. And the van Lommel study found that 18% of patients who survived a cardiac arrest reported a near-death experience. Sam Parnia's study used a classification scale that was a little bit more conservative, so the number was lower, about 6%. So we have a problem. I'm sure many in this room have heard of the phrase the explanatory gap. I think what this represents is something that we might call, since we're in Tucson, the grand explanatory gap. Okay? So the explanatory gap is how do we get from the normal functioning brain to an everyday ephemeral experience? How do we bridge that gap? This gap is even wider because we have a hypofunctional brain in a clinically dead individual, and on the other hand, we have a conscious experience that is so rich and profound that the memories can be indelible and the impact can be existentially transformative. Now, there are many individuals who would suggest that this chasm really can't be crossed. There is no bridge that can cross them. And they propose that the near-death experience represents a critical counter-instance to any kind of true science of consciousness. Because if I can have a rich conscious experience with a hypofunctioning brain, then perhaps the brain is not really the source of consciousness in the first place. And furthermore, consciousness perhaps is not even of this corporeal world. Now, I and my collaborator, Dr. Jimo Borzigan, feel like there must be some kind of neuroscientific explanation, however far off in the distance that might be. So today I'm going to talk about some of the experimental work we did to help establish a foundation for a rational neuroscientific understanding of the near-death experience. I'm going to start by giving you a little relevant background, a brief background on consciousness and unconsciousness in terms of the neurobiology. And then I'm going to move into the neurobiology of the dying brain with a particular focus on electrical surges that have been reported both in humans and that we have studied in a rodent model. So first, a little background. I think many of these slides will be familiar to you. The first making the assertion that consciousness is not correlated with activity at the level of the primary sensory cortex. And what you can see here is a nice illustration of what is often referred to as contrastive analysis, where a stimulus is delivered at threshold where you may or may not perceive it, and then there's a contrasting or comparison of the activation patterns. And what you can see with the non-detected sound is that there's still an activation of the posterior half of the superior temporal gyrus, which is the site of the primary auditory cortex. Now, by contrast, when the sound is detected, you see activation of a more widespread network that prominently involves the prefrontal cortex and posterior parietal cortex. Now, lest you think that that's restricted to the auditory modality, this has also been shown in a number of different ways with respect to vision. This is an electrophysiological study that concluded that these early evoked potentials, such as arising from V1 and even higher visual areas, were not correlated with conscious experience, but instead this more widespread activation and longer latency potentials that were more associated with prefrontal cortex. Now, it's also important for me to note that in addition to these feed-forward pathways in the dorsal and ventral stream going to the prefrontal cortex, there are also a number of feedback processes. And this is referred to variously in the literature, originally reentrant processing, also recurrent processing, reverberant processing, reafferent processing, feedback, top-down. I'll be referring to it as feedback processing. And this is also thought to be critical for conscious experience. Now, I know that there's some controversy and that this might relate to report or access consciousness versus phenomenal consciousness, but there are a number of compelling parallels in terms of anesthetic-induced unconsciousness. So, just as consciousness is not correlated with activity at the level of the primary sensory cortex, neither is anesthetic-induced unconsciousness correlated with an inactivation or deactivation of primary sensory cortex. And this work was performed by Stephen Laurie's group. And what you can see here in the transverse and sagittal section of the brain, primary visual networks, primary auditory networks that are relatively unperturbed after the individual goes into a state of propofol-induced unconsciousness. Just as conscious experience seems to be correlated with activity in extended frontoparietal networks, so too is unconsciousness. I've shown examples here of slow-wave sleep in general anesthesia associated with a deactivation of these frontoparietal networks. This is the lateral and medial surface of the brain. Just as consciousness seems to be associated with longer latency potentials rather than early ones, so too with general anesthesia. This is an example from a rodent study performed by Dr. Tony Huditz, who's made his appearance here many times. And there are visual evoked potentials, and what you can see is these early potentials, likely related to more primary processing, again, relatively unperturbed despite increasing concentrations of the inhaled anesthetic desflurane. And by contrast, you can see the longer latency potentials making a dose-dependent decrease. Now, part of those longer latency potentials relate to the feedback connectivity that I talked about before. Again, this is Tony Huditz's work, and you're looking at the rat brain. This is the front, this is the back. This was a study of visual evoked potentials with transfer entropy in the gamma bandwidth. And you can see in the normal waking state that there is a balance of feed-forward connectivity going from the occipital to the frontal cortex. That's denoted in the green arrows. And feedback connectivity coming from the prefrontal cortex going posteriorly as depicted by the red arrows. Now, when the animal goes into a state of anesthetic-induced unconsciousness, that feed-forward connectivity and processing remains, it persists. And what is selectively inhibited is this feedback connectivity, and that's denoted here by the thinner arrows in red. So Tony Huditz's group showed this in an animal model, and that motivated us to conduct a number of studies in human volunteers as well as human surgical patients in which we confirmed that this occurred, not just with the inhaled anesthetic isoflurane, but with all major classes of general anesthetics. So what you're looking at here is a study of symbolic transfer entropy derived from EEG in the frontal and parietal areas with 3 different drugs, ketamine, propofol, and sevoflurane. Now, it was mentioned a few times yesterday how ketamine anesthesia is quite unique. It's different at the molecular level, it's different at the neurophysiological level. It actually activates the cortex as opposed to depressing it, like drugs such as propofol or sevoflurane. So this red tracing is the feedback, blue feed forward. Note in the humans that the feedback is dominant, unlike the rats. This blue shaded area is when the drug is being administered, and thereafter the subjects are unconscious. And what you can see is a reduction of that feedback connectivity during induction, and in essence it becomes neutralized with feed-forward connectivity, which is relatively spared. And in the bottom panel you see the asymmetry of feedback and feed-forward connectivity being neutralized. So this was an exciting finding for us because ketamine has been the problem child of general anesthetic mechanism frameworks. And I wanted to acknowledge the work of Dr. Anshul Lee, who's in the audience. He was the first author on many of these articles, which received attention in our field and also in the lay press. So to summarize this portion of the talk, consciousness and anesthesia are not correlated with activity or inactivity at the level of the primary sensory cortex, but instead are related to activity or inactivity in frontoparietal networks. And I bring up these experiments because it's going to provide a backdrop to some of our experimental work in the dying brain. So now moving on to that neurobiology of the near-death state, and I want to focus on electrical surges that have been reported in dying humans. This literature comes from anesthesiology, also intensive care medicine, palliative care medicine, and there have been scattered reports of a strange surge of activity just prior to death. And Stuart Hameroff was actually describing something he experienced in the operating room that was similar to this. And many of these reports are derived from a processed EEG monitor called the bispectral index monitor. So the BIS has frontal electrodes, and it extracts features of the EEG, some related to unconsciousness, such as burst suppression, others that might more reflect an awake state, such as high beta activity. And it combines these parameters in a multivariate and proprietary algorithm, and then it spits out a number, an index, between 0 and 100, where 0 is basically no activity, a suppressed EEG, and 100 is close to the waking state. I would note that the range of 40 to 60 is considered consistent with general anesthesia. And you can see an example of the BIS monitor here and its tracing. Now let me show you a few examples of these surges, and these were reported by Dr. Chawla, who spoke, I believe, at this conference in terms of the interpretation of this electrical surge in relationship to the near-death experience. So you can see that the tracing starts out at around 80. That would be a state consistent with sedation. In this case, it could have been pharmacologic. It could have also been from a depressed level of consciousness due to the underlying pathophysiology. And that remains relatively stable until it starts to decrease, and then you see this surge going up to the baseline, and then it goes to 0 when the patient dies. This is an even more striking example. This is starting out in a range of 40 to 60, and again, that's a range that's consistent with a state of general anesthesia. This could have been due, again, to pharmacologic interventions or due to the underlying pathophysiology itself. But you can see that starting to decrease, it's waxing and waning, then there's a little surge, and then an increase, not just to the baseline, but really up to normal values for a waking individual just prior to it dropping to 0 when the patient dies. Now, there was some interpretation of this as potentially being related or the underlying neurobiology of the near-death experience. You have this surge when you're in the near-death state, this electrical surge, and it's accounting for the phenomenology that I discussed. But there are some critical difficulties in that interpretation. First of all, these patients died, so they didn't come back, they weren't resuscitated, and they couldn't tell the tale of what the experiential content was in association with that electrical surge. Second of all, the surge may simply reflect a non-specific activation. It's not hard to imagine that if you're in a hypoxic or hypoglycemic state, your neurons are losing structural integrity, they're starting to spill glutamate, you have excitatory activity, that the brain's basically going haywire and you're going to see a surge of EEG activity. That's not compelling enough You can see high activity during a seizure in a state of unconsciousness. So what we want to know is, does this surge reflect an organized, meaningful activity that might account for the phenomenology? And third, there are also some limitations in the bispectral index itself. And this is something that I've studied extensively with my colleague, Dr. Michael Avedon at Washington University. We've conducted several large randomized control trials, one published in the New England Journal several years ago that I'm just going to briefly touch upon. This was called the BAG recall trial. We took a population at high risk for intraoperative awareness. This was a randomized, multi-center study with almost 6,000 patients enrolled and interviewed for awareness events during surgery. And what we found at the end of the day was that there was no difference in the awareness incidence between the group randomized to the bispectral index monitor and a group randomized to alarms just based on standard anesthetic concentration, a pharmacologic dosing strategy that goes back to the 1960s. So it's difficult to think about the BIS as a true reflection of the underlying state of consciousness. And this is part of what motivated the current study. So my collaborator and colleague, Dr. Jimo Borzigan at the University of Michigan, had made interesting observations in her laboratory about 5 years prior to the study I'm about to describe, and she had this strong interest in near-death experiences, found out that I had done work on the BIS and that my laboratory did work on metrics of conscious experience, and so she approached me in May of 2012, and this was really a very dynamic collaboration. She emailed me in May of 2012, and 15 months later, we had this paper published in PNAS. And again, I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Anshul Lee, who is co-first author, as well as Dr. Dinesh Pal, who also presented here. He's in the audience, who handled the experimental work. So the methods of this study were relatively straightforward. We took about 10 rats, we implanted them with bilateral frontal, parietal, and occipital EEG. This is not on the scalp like in humans, but on the epidural surface. We also placed electrodes to record muscle activity, electromyography or EMG, as well as heart activity, electrocardiography or EKG. And then we recorded that electrophysiology during a waking state, during general anesthesia with ketamine and xylazine, and that's a very common cocktail that's used for animal experiments. And then after the animal was anesthetized for a period of time, death was induced by an intracardiac injection of potassium chloride, which is going to rapidly cause a cardiac arrest. We then analyzed the EEG for absolute and relative power, basic spectral properties, looking at the contribution of different frequency bandwidths to the overall EEG pattern. We also looked at functional connectivity, and we used a measure of coherence, and then also effective connectivity using a measure of symbolic transfer entropy. We analyzed cross-frequency coupling, but I'm not going to discuss that today. So symbolic transfer entropy has been referred to as both effective or directional connectivity. I think the key point really is that it attempts to measure causal interactions between two signals in the brain. And I'm just going to give you a brief background on how it does that. So if we wanted to predict the behavior of this signal, the target signal Y, and we wanted to see how this point in the future Y was behaving, we might look at the past of that signal and try to build a model to predict the signal's future. Now, if we took information from a second signal, the source signal X in this green area, and we added it to this information, and we found that the addition of that information helped us better predict that point in the future, then we make an inference of causality. We say if including this information actually helps us better understand the future, then perhaps this signal has informed the other signal, had a causal influence on that outcome. This is laden with assumptions, of course, but this is the background. So again, we looked at power, we looked at functional connectivity, and we looked at effective connectivity, and I'm now going to show you those data. So the first thing that we found was a surge of gamma and theta power after cardiac arrest. You're looking at a spectrogram, and you all understand the concept of a spectrum. Everybody's seen a rainbow, or you've seen white light shown into a prism and then coming out as a spectrum of colors. Something very similar with the EEG, but instead of a prism, we use a Fourier transformation that helps us get a sense of the relative contributions of different frequency bandwidths. So this is a relative spectrogram, so looking at the relative changes in the awake state, the anesthetized state, and then after cardiac arrest. Now you can see that things pretty quickly are going haywire after cardiac arrest. So we expanded this window for the first 30 seconds after cardiac arrest. And what you can see in this circled area, this redness in the area of 40 hertz, as well as redness in the theta range, suggest that there is an increase in power. And for gamma, there is an absolute increase too, not just a relative one. You can see this over in the histogram. What you're looking at down here are the different frequency bandwidths, and there are 3 bars reflecting the waking state, the anesthetized state, and the state after cardiac arrest. And you can see that in the theta and gamma bandwidths, there is an increase after cardiac arrest. So the power is going up. And in fact, in this low gamma bandwidth, it's going up well beyond the normal waking state. Now, I'm sure people have heard a lot about 40 hertz in this audience. You might not know that theta is of particular importance for the rat. Anybody who's done animal experiments knows that theta reflects either an active exploratory waking state for the rat or a state of REM sleep. But again, this is just another surge. Maybe it doesn't really mean anything. Well, it turns out that this gamma and theta activity is highly coherent across the brain. So now you're looking at a plot of coherence. And again, the more red activity reflects an increase. And you can see after, in this third stage of cardiac arrest, you can see this hotspot around 40 hertz. You can also see high gamma that's looking very, very coherent. And just to show it to you quantitatively, again, there's an increase in theta coherence, functional connectivity, as well as an increase in gamma that far exceeds the waking state. But we still can't really make strong conclusions from this because you can have highly coherent or synchronized activity during a seizure. When you're unconscious, you can have it during certain anesthetized states or pathological states of unconsciousness. So it's still not quite telling the tale. But when we looked at the symbolic transfer entropy, which is, again, at least attempting to reflect causal interactions or communication across the brain, we saw something similar. And what you're looking at here, again, you see the different frequency bandwidths on the bottom. The 3 bars represent the waking state, the anesthetized state, and after cardiac arrest. And you can see in both the feed forward and the feedback directions, major surges in theta and gamma. The gamma in the feedback direction after a cardiac arrest was 8-fold higher in terms of symbolic transfer entropy. Now, these data are a little bit more provocative. We don't know what the experiential content was for the rat in this state, but we do know that these metrics have been shown in humans to be correlated with waking states and anesthetized states, and they seem to be surging in this near-death state after cardiac arrest. So there are a number of critical questions, though, that we have to ask. First of all, could the signal just be artifact? This was something that I was concerned about. If the brain activity is down and the heart is still fibrillating after that cardiac arrest, we might see a high-frequency activity that's just being picked up in the brain, and that's going to look highly coherent because it's coming from one source. Number 2, could this arousal, maybe it was real. Maybe it didn't have to do with the cardiac arrest, but had to do with that needle going into the heart, injection of potassium chloride. So maybe the animal was just waking up during that state, and we were seeing a true arousal in the EEG. And the third question is more philosophical or metascientific, which is, can we really infer something about human consciousness from a rat, and in particular, a rich altered state of consciousness from electrophysiological recordings in the rat. So in terms of the first question, I feel confident that these EEG results are not due to signal artifacts. So what you're looking at here is a comparison of muscle activity and brain activity, EMG and EEG, heart activity, and brain activity, EKG and EEG, and then a comparison of muscle and heart activity. These are correlation plots, and you can see that the correlation is hovering around 0 for all of them, suggesting that the signals that we're looking at are independent of one another. We're not just looking at heart activity with an EEG electrode. Second of all, we used an alternative mode of death. So instead of this intracardiac injection of potassium chloride, we also had a model of respiratory arrest. So the animals were anesthetized, then they were inhaling carbon dioxide. Now, unlike a needle going into your chest, carbon dioxide would actually depress your consciousness. If you're anesthetized and you become hypercarbic, you become more difficult to arouse, not less difficult. So this really controls for this noxious stimulus possibility. And what you see is a similar surge of power. You can see it in that 40 hertz bandwidth, and that is quantitatively significant, and a similar surge of coherence. And I've put up both the cardiac arrest and the respiratory arrest coherence plots, and you can see that they look very similar. Both have this 40 hertz activation, and you can also see this high gamma increase of coherence. Showing it quantitatively, theta returning to about baseline levels, and this low gamma, again, after respiratory arrest, surging beyond the normal waking level in terms of functional connectivity. Now, this question is obviously more difficult. Can we infer something about human consciousness from the rat? Well, I think we can. Others have made the claim over the past few days, and we tried to systematically make the claim in an article last year that the neural machinery that's required for consciousness of the environment probably is present in the rat. But the question of this altered experience, such as a near-death experience, well, can we really infer something from a rat in terms of that kind of rich, strange phenomenology? And I would make the argument that we can, and I'd like to use an analogy of REM sleep. And I'm going to make 3 uncontroversial statements. The first uncontroversial statement is that rats sleep and that they exhibit REM sleep. There's no sleep neurobiologist who would dispute that. Number 2, we know that humans sleep, and humans have REM sleep. And if I were to show you the neurophysiologic tracings between the human and rat, you might be hard-pressed to appreciate the differences. But most importantly is number 3, which is humans have vivid, rich, bizarre, hallucinatory experiences during REM sleep. So during that neurophysiologic process that really has a homologue in the rat, we're having a very rich, crazy phenomenology. And we don't say, well, that's not REM sleep, and the neurophysiology isn't a good explanation of that because you also have it in a rat. I don't know what happens in the rat brain when that activation happens during REM sleep. I know what happens to me. And similarly, with this near-death state, perhaps there is a neurophysiologic homology that might not match up in terms of the phenomenology. So to summarize this last portion of the talk, surges of EEG activity have been identified in humans around the time of death, but again, we can't really interpret those signals. In our experimental models of cardiac and respiratory arrest, we see an associated surge of power, functional connectivity, but most importantly, effective connectivity in that state. And some of these features, as I showed you earlier in the talk, are associated with conscious processing. So Andy Warhol once noted that in the future, everybody would be famous for 15 minutes, and of course he predicted this nauseating era of reality TV. But our paper had its 15 minutes. I mean, we thought it would be of broad interest, but it really was it attracted worldwide media attention, including the front page of the Washington Post with a rat study. And I think probably the reason why that happened is what had gone on before in 2012, less than a year before our paper was published. Now, there have been books on near-death experiences that go back to the first one in the 1970s by Ray Moody, Life After Life, really kind of the seminal work. But in 2012, you had surgeons, in the case of Ibn Alexander, a neurosurgeon who had conducted neuroscience, who was in a state of coma, who had a very profound near-death experience, and then who wrote a book modestly entitled Proof of Heaven. Now, I'm not here to adjudicate between heaven and earth and God and man, but I do think that it's shaky to take one experience and try to have that constitute a proof of the afterlife. But you have to understand, this is very compelling. I mean, this guy's a brain surgeon who's done brain science, and he is making the claim, look, my brain could not have been the source of that conscious experience. These kinds of reports, which made it to the cover of Newsweek and many media outlets, are very, very influential, and they bear directly on the possibility of a science of consciousness. Because the argument is, if I have this rich conscious experience when my brain is in this profound state of hypofunction, again, maybe the brain isn't the source of consciousness. So with that, again, I would like to acknowledge my collaborator, Dr. Jimo Borjigan, who had been thinking about near-death experiences for 5 years. It was an interesting tale of serendipity. She happened to be just down the hall from us. And again, a lot of work went on in a very short period of time to generate that paper. Much of that work conducted by Drs. Anshul Lee and Dr. Dinesh Pal. Now, they were actually describing their hiking trip the other day with the conference, and it sounded like they almost had a few near-death experiences themselves. And many in the audience were probably thinking about this as the bus almost went off the cliff. I'd like to thank everybody in my lab. We have an interdisciplinary research team with neuroscientists, anesthesiologists, physicists, biomedical engineers. We even have some philosophers that rotate through the lab, taking a multidisciplinary approach to the scientific and clinical topic of consciousness. I'd like to thank my funding sources, in particular the NIH and the James S. McDonald Foundation. And finally, I'd like to thank you for your kind attention. Again, I thank the organizers for the invitation to speak at this historically significant conference. And before I close, I want to let you know that we're currently working on a Center for Consciousness Science at the University of Michigan Medical School. I have a funding source from our department, and we have the departments of neurology, psychiatry, physiology, and the neuroscience graduate program on board, and we're hoping to launch this later this year. I might be calling on some of you to come give a talk or serve on an advisory board. Again, thank you, and I'll be happy to address any questions you might have. Thank you.
Do you have any other mics? Shout it out. Oh, here you go.
Does it seem possible that this is more likely just a last-ditch? Would this more likely be a last-ditch effort by the organism to save its life, or like a panic attack as it gathers all its resources to save itself?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And another way of framing that question might be, well, what is the function? Could there be a function of these kinds of surges, or maybe even an evolutionary advantage if the organism is in a state of near demise? Is this some kind of last-ditch effort at cognition to try to avoid that outcome? It's possible. Obviously, I don't know the answer, but if you think about the states in which near-death experiences happen, and by the way, you don't need to be near death to have a near-death experience. You could be in a state of crisis or have a fear that you're going to die. These are sometimes referred to as the fear-death experiences. And I think something that's common to the cardiac arrest, to the fear, to the drowning, to the initial coma would be some kind of stress response and catecholaminergic surge that might be influencing these neurophysiologic patterns. So excellent question.
Yes, excellent talk. As you well know, the hippocampus embeds gamma cycles within theta cycles, and that's a major part of encoding new segments of experience and this type of stuff. So theta, gamma suggest hippocampus, does it not?
So an excellent point, and I think it's important to point out, especially in the rat, when you're recording EEG over the parietal lobe, what you're probably picking up is theta from the hippocampus. And you see that with direct hippocampal electrodes during the waking state and during REM sleep. So it's very possible that the hippocampus could be playing into this. We're actually starting to do some work, and actually Dr. Dinesh Pal conducted a first experiment looking at hippocampal place cells in unit recordings. Oh yes, absolutely.
Hi, I'm a electroencephalographer in cognitive neuroscientist. First, great talk, very fascinating. Have a couple technical concerns which are best served by reading your papers. So the question I'm going to ask right now is this. If we presume then that the near-death experience is some type of hallucinatory activity that's occurring, kind of a last moment hallucinatory activity, why is it so consistent, its general features so consistent amongst individuals? My dreams differ from day to day, and I'm sure my dreams are going to differ from you and more or less everybody else in the room. So how would one explain this kind of general consistency that are in the phenomenological reports?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I don't know the answer. First of all, I want to make clear that I was only making an analogy to REM sleep, and I wasn't suggesting, as some people have suggested, that perhaps the near-death state is some kind of REM intrusion. I don't know. I mean, you know, there are many different phenomena that need to be accounted for. We're not even really addressing content of consciousness. Everything that I've shown you really is just relating to a level of consciousness, which is why I brought up the parallels with consciousness and anesthesia. But what I would say is this was a very stereotyped response across all rats. And you know, Dr. Lee, when he was analyzing, even said, it's like I'm looking at the same rat. So we did find this very similar kind of stages, these 3 electrophysiological stages after cardiac arrest, and very similar phenomena. So again, I don't know the answer. It's a great question and worthy of further investigation.
I wanted to ask about the evolutionary implications of this. This phenomenon clearly cannot be adaptive in the sense of contributing to reproduction of the individual. What evolutionary purpose could it serve?
Well, again, you know, I was talking about first in terms of animals, of just serving a potentially evolving as a cognitive response or a last-ditch cognitive surge to try to get out whatever perilous situation the organism was in. Now, we can think about it in humans on a different level. Does it serve some sort of, on a more sociological level, of people who are experiencing this near-death phenomenology and coming back to tell the tale and having that mitigate our perspectives of death, society? I don't know. That's mere speculation.
That wouldn't work with rats.
Well, I know, but that's why I started out by saying that in the rodents and in animals, I attributed the surge to having an evolutionary advantage in terms of cognition.
Sorry, next was it you? Yeah, okay.
Sorry. Hi. I've heard some speculative reports about endogenous releases of DMT during sleep and near-death experiences. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that causing some of these experiences.
Yeah, so the question is about DMT or dimethyltryptamine, which is a very potent hallucinogen. I mean, it's very interesting, especially with respect to the near-death experience, because in even a short time frame, one has a subjective experience that's much longer than the objective elapse. In the 60s, it used to be called the working man's trip because you could take it during lunchtime and get back to the office at 1. There has been discussion of a pineal release of DMT. Actually, Dr. Borgigan was part of a study that was published just after the one I described, identifying DMT in the pineal gland, but it has not yet been linked to release during the near-death state. So it's out there. The neurobiology is starting to catch up with some of the speculation.
Speaking to the using rats as models for consciousness and sleep, adding to what you're saying, the hippocampal play cells play out during normal behavior, being sort of a model for an event recording. But they also, the same sequences play back during the next sleep epoch, suggesting that they're replaying the previous day just as much as sleep content does.
Yes, and actually, you know, you've also pointed to a potentially interesting model for thinking about this memory recall, whether or not you have some kind of reactivation that's going on in the near-death state. Yes?
So the symbolic transfer entropy measure, right? It seems to me that, isn't it the case that what the story could also be non-causal in the sense that you could have a third, right? You could have a
Absolutely.
third structure that has some delay between the two. Is that correct?
It is absolutely correct, and I'm very glad that you brought that up. So we're just looking at two sources on the cortex. Maybe this isn't a cortical-cortical connection. Maybe it's a cortical-thalamo-cortical. Now, one thing I will point out in terms of the work that we've done with consciousness and anesthesia, we've looked at symbolic transfer entropy and a number of other measures in humans during the awake state and during anesthetic-induced unconsciousness. Melanie Bolie published an article in 2012 using dynamic causal modeling to try to test the different potential scenarios that you brought up. Is this cortical-cortical? Is this cortex and individual connections to the thalamus, or is it a thalamocortical loop? And what she found with propofol-induced unconsciousness is that indeed the communication seemed to be cortical-cortical. So I can't say that in terms of the near-death state with the rats, but I can say that some of the earlier data that we showed that there is some corroborating evidence that it's a true cortical-cortical interaction. Thank you for bringing that up.
Do you think that those cases in the near-death experience literature of long-duration epoch clinical death support the idea that consciousness is independent of brain function, particularly those drowning cases, 3 to 4 hours of apparent clinical death, and the strange outlier of George Rodinai of 3 days?
Well, you're asking me what I feel. I mean, I'm going to be clear about my bias. I mean, I think that consciousness and experience come from the brain. And so until we've ruled out every potential neuroscientific explanation, and that might take a long time, I'm going to believe that there's a neurobiological basis for the experience. Again, my bias and my approach.
I have a completely non-experiential question that regards differences between your results in the effects of anesthetics on the brain and the earlier studies that were conducted by Michael Alkire, for instance, and by Fizet.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that I was puzzled that they found both, one using isoflurane and the other one using propofol. If you overlaid them, they showed a very clear reduction in activity, particularly in the occipital lobe on the medial surface, which is the primary visual cortex. And I was wondering why this is an obvious conflict to what has been reported now, and whether there would be a methodological or whatever else type of explanation for it.
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, some of the earlier studies had to do more with metabolic activity and metabolic depression, and I'm not sure, the work by Stephen Laurie's group in terms of the fMRI was looking at more connectivity within the networks rather than metabolic activity per se. That might be a source, but also in terms of the electrophysiology, both scientifically and clinically, we usually see that these earlier potentials and more primary processing tends to be preserved. Now, it's also a dose-dependent phenomenon, and that might be another important player here. I mean, at some dose of anesthesia, you're going to suppress all activity. So another question might be, well, if they were just over the border of just over unconsciousness versus in a state of surgical anesthesia or beyond, I would imagine that you would get very different kinds of results. Thank you.
Thank you, George. That was really great and very well appreciated. And we'll have a little panel at the end after Sue's talk. So it's my great pleasure to introduce the second speaker, Susan Blackmore, a psychologist and well-known author and figure in the consciousness studies community, I guess. She was at the second conference in '96 and has been coming back at least intermittently ever since. She's written a number of books in the field of consciousness that are very well known, including a textbook. And her topic is consciousness and death, dying all the time. Susan Blackmore. Let's give her a big hand.
Who's frightened of death? Who I love the one, he's so determined he's going to say, not me. Who's not frightened of death? Who didn't put their hand up? Fair enough, okay. It's kind of weird, isn't it, death? I mean, but what is it we're afraid of? I think that unlike most other animals, we're not afraid really, when it comes to it, of the body dying, other than through the pain. It's something about me. I'm going to be dead. I'm not going to exist anymore. I'm not going to go on having this stream of consciousness. So it relates very closely to the nature of self. And indeed, as we know all too well, questions of consciousness keep coming back to questions of self. So who am I? Well, here I am. Right, I want you all to join me in being here now. What is it like to be me now? Do it yourself, okay? Just for a moment. Be who you are, what it's like to be you now. Okay, you know what it's like, don't you? I don't know what it's like for you, but you know what it's like for you. Or maybe you don't. My concern is this. Here I am. Ooh, I'm me. I'm Sue Blackmore. I'm standing up here. You're all out there. I'm in here looking at you. It feels like that at the moment. But I suggest that that is a very temporary construction. An illusion, you might say. An illusion because we make this very simple mistake. Every time we ask, am I conscious now? Or what is it like to be me? Or in some sense, we sort of wake up and think about ourselves being conscious. Or we ask about the hard problem or qualia. In those moments, I would say the brain is constructing a me. And that's who I am. There's nothing illusory about that in the sense that then that's how it is. The illusion is this. We keep thinking it's the same one every time. Actually, I would say what's happening is, oh, I've already drifted off. There's a new one now. Oh, hello, it's me. It is different. A lot's happened in the brain since last time I said this. And I was too busy, or this thing was too busy thinking about what it's going to say next, to have any continuity. Now, those of you who are deeply mindful, really, really mindful, including mindful of self, in the moment, won't get this lapsing. But any of us who've tried it know how hard that is. Talking about it from the personal experience point of view, I would say this. I think the delusion of self is all about the delusion of continuity. Selves pop up and then they disappear again. It's what we would expect in a brain, but it's what happens in experience too, the more you look for it. And there are two ways of practicing this. I'm just having fun practicing these things. One's quite easy and one's quite hard. The easy one is to notice are you conscious now? Did you get a sense of, oh, here it comes again? It's to notice that every time it happens, every day, and it may be thousands of times, it may not be very many, to notice the appearance of, oh, here I am again, or here is someone anyway, this is me now, and allow, as it were, that that's a different me from a few moments ago. The much harder one is to watch it disappearing. How many of you practice staying awake as you're falling asleep? Yeah, then it's similar to that, only harder, or, well, I don't know if it's harder, it's very similar. So here I am, I'm in here, you're out there, I'm looking at you, watch that disappear. And I submit that it does disappear, and what happens to the human being is it goes back to what its natural state, multiple parallel processing, multiple drafts if you like, parallel backwards threads if you like in my terminology. There's many ways of describing it, just a parallel machine doing its stuff. But because every so often a self pops up, we think it's permanent. And that's the thing that we're frightened of dying. But I submit that if we're rather used to it dying all the time, then we're not so frightened anymore. Now, I wanted to talk about near-death experiences. Partly I was going to mention them rather briefly, but because Sam Parney is not here, I thought I'd better say more about it. And we've just had the most wonderful introduction from Dr. Mashur, and I hope that I'll be reflecting some rather different way of looking at it. But I think his research helps enormously with how we can understand near-death experiences. So, as he mentioned, Some of us had a near-death experience a couple of days ago. And I will just briefly describe what happened. So we set off in our... Hands up who was in the famous bus. Right, good on you, friends. So we set off and we got round the corner and the bus went like that as the driver went over a curb. And I thought, this driver doesn't really know how his bus turns corners. So off we went to Sabina Canyon, and we're coming in the entrance, and there's a car park, and there's a big sort of metal shed thing, and we're going along, and suddenly there's that noise, and everyone's going, stop, stop, and you could see this kind of thing going along by the window, and everyone's shouting stop, and he stops, and then he started again, and bang, the corner of the shed comes straight through the window, and glass all over the bus. Tucson participants are wonderful. Nobody panicked. I could hear people saying, "Are you all right? Is there any glass in your eyes?" And everyone was fine, and we all got off the bus, and we went into Sabino Canyon, and they got us a different bus, but they left us the same driver. I think that hut was probably lined up with that straight line before. It certainly wasn't wonky. And there you can see the corner gone straight through the bus. So we get back in our new bus and we go up to Mount Lemmon, and we set off down from Mount Lemmon. And there seems something a little bit weird going on, like this engine, this driver is not using the engine to go slowly down the hill. He's using his brakes all the time. And can I smell something a bit funny? And the people in the front of the bus are going, stop, stop, there's a terrible smell. And he doesn't stop for quite a long time, and now smoke starts belching out, and eventually, and we stop in a lay-by, and there's clouds of white smoke. And the wheels are so hot that if you are the wheel, I'm coming towards you. I'm sorry, you've never been a wheel before, have you? Yeah, that's it, exactly. And some of us thought, well, why don't we just wait half an hour, and it's quite pleasant here in the mountains, and we'll set off down again. And others are saying, look, the wheels are so hot, we're going to have a blowout on the way down. And this is a windy road, and yeah. So we split into two camps, and we were all very civilized. And after about 3 hours, we went rather late to dinner. So that was our near-death experience. And did anybody have this experience on the bus? Probably not. But one of the things I would mention is that you don't have to be near death to have a near-death experience. Indeed, as some of you know, I had all of the features of the near-death experience many, many years ago as a student. Except for the life review, I didn't have that, and I wasn't near death at all. People have near-death experiences when they fall off a cliff and think they're going to die, but then they land somewhere safely, or other things where they're very scared, or sometimes just out of the blue, completely unpredictably. But there's something very strange here, and one of the questioners asked that, and I hope to try and answer better that question: why does it unfold in this traditional way? You've seen some of these things. One of the problems that I have with this is the polarization of opinions on what the near-death experience is. Either heaven is real, and this doctor, because he's a doctor, of course, it's obviously true that God and the soul are real, and death is not the end of personal existence, but only a transition. Normally, the opposite view to this is not the one I've just tried to give you, but it's a new low. Oh, it's terrible. It's all rubbish. Let's reject the whole thing. And really, there seem to be two camps. And this is something that frustrated me so much. I used to do a lot of work on near-death and out-of-body experiences. And I gave it all up until Dave Chalmers drags me back and says, will you speak about death and consciousness? So I'm dragging it all back from a long time ago. But the experience I had again and again and again with the media was this absolute polarization. Either on the one side, you say, it's all real, it's proof of life after death, the soul carries on forever, and those are good people and nice people who believe that, they're spiritual people who believe nice things, and they're kind, compassionate, lovely people. And then on the other side, you have people like me, who are bad and wicked because they say it's just hallucinations, it's just activity in the brain, it's only things going on, it's reductionist, it's what's the worst, materialist, it's all those horrible things that nasty people say. And the end for me of doing this research was a program called The Day I Died, and I explained to them that I didn't want to take part in this program because I'd stopped doing research on near-death experiences because I suspected they would have this dichotomy. Oh, no, 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 we're going to be true to the science and blah, blah, blah. And any of you who've seen it, I still get emails from people saying they saw it and how wicked I am and how could I possibly say such terrible things and all that. Because, of course, they set you up to be the devil. I don't need to say, I'm very pleased that Dr. Mashur said, given you a little introduction, because I just threw in a few slides because of Sam not being here. This is some of the very early research by Ken Ring, and what's particularly interesting about this is that the order in which the aspects of the near-death experience tend to go, which are going down a dark tunnel towards a light, emerging from the light, having an out-of-the-body experience, going off into another world where you may meet other people, see extraordinary things, maybe a life review, maybe not, then a decision or a barrier or a boundary and a decision to return, and maybe, even rarer, some more profound experiences that I'll come to at the end. Now, I do need somebody to shut me up when I'm going on too long. Dave, what's the rules? We haven't got a flashing light. And Stu, if you're the chair, can you tell me when it's 5 minutes, please? When I've got 5 minutes left, I mean. Okay. Thank you. So what's very interesting about this is that the earlier stages are more common. I mean, not absolutely, it's not totally clear this, but by and large, the things that come first, the tunnel and the out-of-body experience, are far more common, and the deeper experiences are less common. The later experiences are less common. It looks as though there's some kind of unfolding picture here that is the same all over the world, and it's the same in historical documents we get. And it just needs explaining that there is this systematic progression. It seems a progression through these different stages. It's often said by people who have NDEs that it felt more real than real. Who knows what they mean by that? Yeah, I thought there might be more people here. But yes, then you know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't had those realer than real experiences, you don't. They can occur with various drugs, they can occur in meditation, they can occur in hypnagogic states. But they're wonderful here, and obviously in spontaneous mystical experiences. Suddenly everything is more real than it's ever been before. Combined with a kind of sense, not only is it more real, but it's right. It's how it should be. This is it. All the rest of my life is somehow a mess, a dream, but this is real, absolutely. Woo. Clear will do. And unforgettable. I certainly haven't forgotten my experience, which lasted about 2.5 hours and happened in 1970. And I wouldn't say it's as clear as it was then, but I don't remember very much else from that time. It's a very long time ago, and my brain is, addled by all those drugs and other terrible things. So, let's have a look at some of the aspects of the near-death experience and whether we can understand them and whether we can understand why they unfold the way they do. The tunnel we've understood pretty well for a long time, although I have to say I bet there's more evidence now that we could bring to this, and I think I'm going to be inspired by looking at this again to go back and find out more about it. The tunnels vary from very simple tunnels like this to, this is the drawing I did after my own experience. It doesn't quite convey the fact that it was kind of gloomy and dark. It was like galloping on a horse along a road aligned with trees, and the whole leaves on the ground and all the way around, and there was this alluring light at the end that I was kind of sort of noise going towards this light. And then a friend asked me, "Where are you, Sue?" and turned into an out-of-the-body experience. So that was my tunnel of trees. This is a famous one from Ron Siegel and his work on psychedelic drugs. So the tunnels can take many forms, sewage pipes, underground trains, all sorts of things, but they are dark tunnels with a light at the end. Now, why should this be? Well, if you assume that there is some kind of hyperactivity going on in the visual cortex, or anywhere in the visual system for that matter, then it's perfectly easy to understand why it turns into a tunnel. And it is quite reasonable to think this. There are many reasons. There's the research that we heard today. There's the fact that inhibitory cells, by and large, tend to be smaller and more sensitive to oxygen deprivation, and therefore they stop working, and you get a kind of flood of excitation from the disinhibition. And if you think about the way the visual system works, right the way from the retina through to higher visual cortex, the whole thing is arranged so that there is lots and lots of cells devoted to the fovea and very much fewer towards the periphery, going out like that. And so if you get random excitation flowing through there, and you've got the organization of the columns and so on in visual cortex, if you get straight lines of activation spreading across, they will simply by the transformation that the visual cortex does, will appear like circles or spirals, depending on the angles that they're traveling. And why the bright light in the middle? Well, because there are far more of them in the middle, and if this excitation is building up, what's it going to be like? It's going to be like this bright light coming towards me as the excitation increases until it runs out of energy and disappears. The out-of-body experience is rather more tricky, but interesting in what's happened since those days when in 1970, there was nothing we could use scientifically to understand a near-death experience. an out-of-body experience. But now we know a lot more than we did then. First, I want you to be clear about what is meant by an out-of-the-body experience. It's really frustrating. Wikipedia gets it wrong, and it's got corrected and then made wrong again on Wikipedia. And since Wikipedia is a source of all knowledge in the world, this is important. So I want you to be clear. An out-of-the-body experience is not the same as autoscopy, which is what many people say. Autoscopy is a medically defined phenomenon in which you seem to be still in your body, but you see another you out there, like a double, a doppelganger, and so on. And out-of-the-body experiences, I define it as, in my book and various other places, as an experience in which you seem to perceive the world from a location outside your physical body. So it feels as though you are in another body, the parasomatic thing, the astral body, whatever you want to call it, and you are looking at the physical body. So that's that's the definition. Note that this definition does not imply that anything has left the body. That's left as an open question. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. It's defined as an experience. So when people say, are out-of-body experiences real or not? Well, they happen. They happen all the time. They happen to about 20% of the population. Who's had an out-of-the-body experience? That's probably about 20%. But the question is not, are they real? The question is, does something leave the body? And the answer to that is no. I can't prove that it's no. I just think we know enough about it now to think that it is very unlikely. But back in the old days, I did experiments in my kitchen. In fact, here is an actually what I had in my kitchen. What I did was, when I met people who had out-of-body experiences, particularly if they were people who had them spontaneously, because you can't put someone in a lab and say, have an out-of-body experience now. But what you can do is say, when you next have an out-of-body experience, come to my kitchen. This was suggested by someone who ran a whole astral projection club. And he said, I can come to your kitchen, and I love apple crumble. Cook me an apple crumble, and that'll lure my astral body, and I'll come and see it. So to begin with, every Sunday evening, I put up new targets, and then I sort of did it every month, and I went on for many, many years, and I didn't keep up the randomization every week. I did it less and less often because the results were not very thrilling, but I randomized a 5-digit number. I had 20 words, simple words, and 20 simple objects, and I randomized those and stuck them in the kitchen, somewhere where nobody could see by looking in the window, and people wrote to me. Most people wrote and said, I'm really sorry, I haven't managed to get to your kitchen, and blah, blah. But some wrote and said, I got to your kitchen and I saw 73891. Or I saw dog when it was cat, or whatever it was. Nobody got anything. I think one person got cat when it was, but nobody got anything more. So, this doesn't prove that it's but, A better kind of experiment is the experiments that Sampania would have told us about had he been here. And this is obviously the thing to do, and I'm really pleased people are doing it. What they're doing, it's called the AWARE study. You can look it up, just spelt like AWARE. And they have many hospitals taking part in different parts of the world, and they are putting targets, a bit like my targets, but, a better experiment, way up above on a special ledge or something like that in cardiac units and places where people are resuscitated and so on. And the idea is if the person during their near-death experience goes up to the ceiling and looks at the number or the word and later reports it, this would be really good evidence that something did actually leave the body. Actually, it could be ESP without bodies. There's all sorts of other interpretations, but never mind, it would still be paranormal and it would prove me wrong. So I watch this with great interest. So far as I know, they have not got any people getting it right. If they did get someone getting it right, I'd have to be sure that the controls are adequate, that someone hasn't climbed up and so on, which is tricky, but can be done. I think these experiments could be done well enough to give us an answer. My prediction is they will never get the numbers right more than one would expect by chance. But hey, it's an empirical question, and it would be really exciting and change everything if it were true. However, for the moment, I think it's much more interesting to discover what's going on up here. And we have some wonderful clues. Way back in 1950, Wilder Penfield, you remember he was a real pioneer on electrical stimulation and EEG and so on. In those days, before drugs that could really deal with epilepsy, they had to do surgery inside the brain much more than they do now. Occasionally people do it now, but in a different way. He had very, very crude electrodes looking for the seizure site in this particular woman. And when he hit a certain spot, she said, "Oh my God, I'm leaving my body!" And that was 1950. No more clues, because epileptics start to have drugs and so on. There's no more clues until this absolutely classic paper in 2002 by Olaf Blanke, in which he, with a really recalcitrant case of epilepsy, had to put electrodes, as Masho was describing earlier, under the skull, right in contact with the brain, and he was able to stimulate. He had a matrix of electrodes like that, and was able to stimulate them at will, different ones. And what they found was, in that particular place where the yellow spots are, that they could induce out-of-body experiences, stop them, start them, and get other body distortions, getting longer, getting smaller, things that some of you may have experienced. I certainly have, dramatic distortions of body image. And where is that? Well, it's the good old temporal parietal junction. We were hearing about that yesterday from that fascinating talk by Dr. Graziano. Are you still here? No, he's not still here, but he was talking about the TPJ and its importance in constructing the body image or the body schema. Of course, in order to do anything moving around, we have to have a functioning body schema. And there at that site there in the brain is bringing together stuff from the sensory cortices, from somatosenses, vision, hearing, and so on, putting it all together in making a body schema. So it looks like the out-of-body experience is some kind of distortion of the body schema, and it would make sense if the brain is kind of failing. All our normal delusions, I'm in here and you're out there, and I am this thing, and I'm in control, and I'm the one with free will, and I'm the one who has the stream of experiences. All these delusions are no longer able to be built by this brain as it's falling apart. So it's doing the best it can. And a simplified way of understanding what's going on is I can't cope with a body image anymore. I'll just be up there and look at what's happening. I'll try and put together a bit of hearing, a bit of this and that, make sense of it in a bird's eye view. One of the bits of research I did a long time ago shows that people who dream in bird's eye views are more likely to have out-of-the-body experiences than people who don't. So if it's your kind of default way of imagining things when it's difficult, I mean, imagine now the last time you went to the seaside. Some of you will be up there looking at yourself down by the beach, and others of you will be in there with the crashing waves here. And so the former are more likely to have out-of-body experiences. Some other kinds of research have been going on this. I'm going to shout out A, B, etc., and I want you to say which hand is the grey one, left or right. Okay, A, B, C, D. Okay, and what's happening when you do that, you've got it right, very good, is again, the same part of the brain is involved in doing that. And so these kinds of experiments are teaching us about the brain basis of the body schema. Some other interesting experiments. Thomas Metzinger's done a lot of this, and I'm sure many of you know his book, The Ego Tunnel, and his concept of the phenomenal self model. He's not talking about the body schema, or at least the body schema is only part of the phenomenal self model. Phenomenal self model is that whole delusion. Well, no, it's not a delusion when it's active temporarily. This idea of self, thank you, of the self who's having the stream of experiences. So the soul, in other words, what people think of as a soul, is actually the out-of-body phenomenal self-model. And lots of experiments have been going on, fascinating things like this is inducing an out-of-the-body experience with virtual reality. So the participant standing there, he's filmed from the back, and then his goggles in front of him show the picture of himself from the back. So as he's walking along, he's seeing himself, he's seeing his own back walking along. And you can then do funny experiments like stroking the person, and they see the thing in front being stroked and feel, it's a bit like the rubber hand illusion, if you know about that. They actually, some people at any rate, to a greater or lesser extent, feel that it's the one over there that is being stroked. So these are all ways in which we're beginning to understand how the out-of-body experience works. Now, Stuart's making me hurry up. Has anybody got any water? Because I'm beginning to get a bit, and I don't mind if it's got germs in. So what about these worlds beyond? Well, the worlds beyond are the part of the near-death experience. Don't worry, it's all right, I'll cope. Is the part of the near-death experience that is not so formulaic. In fact, according to your religion, you will see St. Peter at the pearly gates. I looked up St. Peter and the pearly gates on, thank you very much, Google this morning, and it's fascinating. You just get loads and loads of funny cartoons. It's interesting what the selection of memes in Google. I didn't get any real pictures of St. Peter. It's a shame. I'd have shown you one if I did. But, you know, Buddhists will see certain things in the next stage of the experience. Hindus will see different things. These are all culturally determined, which I think is what you'd expect. They're coming out of memory as you've got all this activation going on. But I want to end with some thoughts about what I consider the more profound effects of the near-death experience. See, I think if you just have the out-of-body bit, it's not at all surprising that you come back saying, I went to heaven, I know the soul is real. That's what happened to me. I had this extraordinary experience, and my instant reaction, my whole life depended on that instant reaction, because I immediately jumped to the conclusion, or the conclusion was absolutely inherent in the experience itself. Obviously I can survive without my body, because my body's over there and I'm up here. So there has to be a soul, a spirit, life after death, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, psychokinesis, ghosts, poltergeists, and everything. And that's what I thought until I did some experiments. So I do understand Dr. Eben Alexander and all these people who jump to this conclusion. But for some people, the transformation is not that. And I suggest that for some people, the transformation relates much more to what I was saying at the beginning about the delusions. That the delusions go away when the brain is still just hanging on there, but can no longer build up these full stories about what we are, how continuous we are, how we're having a stream of experiences, and so on. This man, John Wren Lewis, went traveling in Thailand and was poisoned with a sweet in a bus, and very, very nearly died. And he woke up in a ghastly hospital with flies and rats and goodness knows whatever else, but he survived. And he said afterwards, my whole consciousness of myself and everything else has changed. I feel as if the back of my head has been sawn off, so it's no longer the 60-year-old John who looks out at the world, but the shining, dark, infinite void that in some extraordinary way is also I. The back of his head sawn off. Does anyone know that feeling? I don't know that some people are putting their hands up. I don't know the sawing exactly, but I know that kind of opening up, which is quite different from the normal dualist kind of way of experiencing. He said, I feel at home in dazzling darkness. This is very much like the many near-death experiences where people go into the dazzling darkness. But for him, it stayed with him. I was lucky enough to meet him some years later. He lived in Australia. He's died now. Lovely man. I mean, obviously the question in my mind is he really living this? Is he really living non-dual experience all the time? There's not me in the head and the world out there, but there is just stuff emerging from the dazzling darkness. Yes, I think so. Yes, he talked perfectly naturally about it, and he seemed to live that way, and managed to do stuff as well, not, be weird. And he said, my experience is of the universe John Wren Lewising. My experience is the universe Sue Blackmoring. In other words, this is not to deny the existence of self, or to say it's nothing, but it's just the universe throwing up this thing throwing up this thing that we give a name to and we make all these delusions about. There is something, but it's not that kind of soul type sort of consciousness thing, consciousness itself, all that stuff that we assume. It's just the universe, Sue Blackmoring. What's your name? Henry Kong. So it's just the universe, Henry Konging. That sounds much better, doesn't it? You've got a good name for doing that. So all of you, think about that. You know, this is just the universe, whatever it is. Put your own name in there. I'm just going to throw a few more examples at you of non-duality, because I think that's what happens to the most profound near-death experiences, and which really teaches is where the inner transformation comes from in the near-death experience. This is William James in the Varieties of Religious Experience more than 100 years ago. As if the opposites of the world, whose contradictoriness and conflict make all our difficulties and troubles, were melted into unity. And of course, we find this kind of thing all over the place. What happens when one shifts from one view of the world to another? It's not because your soul has gone to heaven or something like that. It's brain stuff. It's brains functioning differently. And some of my favorite examples actually come from drugs. Humphrey Davy, who first tried experimenting with nitrous oxide in 1799, described what happened to him, which really is he started off as a materialist, and then he... The world's made of thoughts. Yes, drugs can do that. And nitrous oxide's wonderful because it wears off really quickly and you go, oh, I'm back to being a materialist again. Oh, no, time some more. Maybe I'm going to hang out in the middle somewhere and not have the problems of either. That's the hard part, of course. And 100 years after that, Ernst Dunbar tried ether. This is the early days of anesthetics. It dawned upon me that the only logical position was subjective idealism, and therefore my experience must be reality. By degrees, I began to realize I was the one, and the universe of which I was the principle was balancing itself into completeness. And then the drug wore off, and he went back to the usual view. So those are just a few examples. I'm trying to link what's going on in the brain, and I'm really grateful to the evidence that we heard just now, because I think it helps with this. How to relate what's happening in a dying brain, or a brain-frightened person, and some profound, life-changing spiritual or mystical experiences. The near-death experience is not real, an angel, or reduction. It is a truly profound, life-changing, mystical experience because of what happens in the brain. Because, I would say, it stops us being deluded into thinking that we are continuous entities, terrified of when we go away. Because actually, we're dying all the time. Thank you.
We'll take a few for Sue, and then bring George up. Come over there, Dave, in the back.
Oh, yeah, of course you will.
Okay, so there's a wonderful neurosurgeon at Stanford, and we have this compassion care network, and he heard about Eben Alexander's experience, and he said, it's kind of hogwash. And, you know, we were wondering, you know, he just doesn't believe in these things. He said, yeah, well, I mean, when I had my experience, I mean, it was after I was operated on, and I was in the recovery room, and there were 5 quarts of blood that were still coming out of my intestines because they hadn't finished sewing me up. And I was up above my body saying, take me back to the operating room, and they couldn't hear me, and it was really ridiculous. And then I started going down this tunnel, and I said, wait a minute, I'm not ready for this. And I found myself back, and then somebody took him back into the surgery, and they sewed it up, and he said, and then I woke up and found myself in the recovery, and they had stitched me back up, but I was really grateful. So it was a really funny thing that he he was saying, "Oh, this is posh," but when I had my experience, so and he was aware.
But you're
of
making
that.
this dichotomy again, and people just fall into it all the time, as though it's either kind of
Right.
The only reason you think it's strange is because either it's got to be real or it's got to be not real. These experiences happen all the time. Yeah, no, well, thank you for the story, yeah. There are lots and lots of these stories, and they're wonderful.
So this is a question to both of you. I would love...
We're meant to be having ones to me at the moment.
Hold that one.
Is a fascinating talk. It's a long shot, but do you have... it made me think while you were talking of Derek Parfit and Daniel Kolak and the IMU open individualism. What are your thoughts on that? That this illusion really should be taken seriously, and that it really makes us much more connected, and should be less fearful of death in that sense.
I don't fully understand it. I mean, are you talking about Derek Parfit's like ego and bundle theories of self, or what are you referring to of that work? Pardon?
There's a book by Daniel Kolak. If you haven't read it,
I haven't.
it sounds very much like you rediscovered some very good stuff that he wrote about.
Thank you. I should look at that. It's not that I've rediscovered, it's all over the place. I think all I'm doing, if anything, is taking stuff that is largely separated off into the scientific literature or the mystical and spiritual literature and say, look, these actually can be understood in the same framework. Parfit's helped me a lot with his analysis of why we tend to be ego theorists in our lives, and we tend to be ego theorists in our lives and bundle theories intellectually and have this awful conflict. And I think doing that really does help reduce the fear of death, because we have a different idea about who it is who's going to die.
Hi, Susan. I have a small question about measuring the other parameters when you're experiencing near-death experience. I've heard.
Can you hold your microphone to your mouth, please?
Hello?
Yeah, you just have to have it very close. That's it.
So I read from a magazine that says the soul weighs 21 grams. It's probably, I don't know when, but it's...
It was 1908 done,
yeah.
yeah.
So have you ever done any experiments like measuring not just the experience itself, but also the physical body, like the weight and the other physical parameters?
Yes, there have been quite a lot of experiments of that kind. Back in 1908 was the most famous one, where people measured the loss of weight at the moment of death. But there are lots of problems here. One is the moment of death. Well, in those days, I mean, you can have a moment of death if somebody, well, you can't really, you can have a sort of drawn out one, but you can have it longer or shorter. Typically, you can't say that's the moment when you die. If you have a theory that the soul leaves the body and goes off, then it's got to leave at a particular moment. But actually, physiologically, it's not like that. So these early studies, when they saw some loss of weight, they had the people who were dying of tuberculosis in the very early 20th century, and they had them on these special weighing beds. But of course, they were sweating, they were probably peeing, there were probably other loss of body fluids and other things going on, and they were not very sensitive. People subsequently tried the experiment. In the 1930s, there were a lot more experiments. They're published in the Society for Psychical Research journals, and they didn't show that the weight that they found that was lost went down and down and down as the methodology improved, and I think it's now generally agreed that the only weight loss is through fluids. And the idea of a soul weighing anything is quite strange anyway, isn't it?
Thanks very much, Sue. I just wanted to ask about your neurophysiologic explanation of that near-death tunnel experience. It struck me, have there ever been any rod achromats, people with rod achromatopsia, who have had a near-death experience? Because my understanding is they lack the magnification factor in the visual cortex. So if there has been a case, you would think that
that would...
that's
very interesting. They certainly lack it in the early visual system. I suppose in the later visual system, it would have started out there and disappear from not being fed from the correct input, wouldn't it? Oh, well, but one would only have to go around and do a survey. That's a very interesting idea, because tunnel experiences are quite common. How many people get them on the verge of sleep? A few of you do. I do occasionally. They're found all over the world in art from different cultures, particularly cultures that use psychedelic drugs. But they're quite common in ordinary people, so we could go and find it. They're quite rare, achromatopsic people, but yeah, thank you.
Okay, one more over there, then we'll have a panel.
Yeah, I'd like to. Lawrence van der Post relates, this is in support of the notion that John Wren Lewis reported. The Kalahari Bushmen, their philosophy basically was that rather than developing their own ego in the world, that the universe came to know them. So it's kind of the antithesis of the notion that you were presenting of the inflated ego, and it's very rationally coherent with what John Wren Lewis is and the European egocentric view is.
Yes, thank you. I didn't know that he'd written that. I absolutely agree. And it's a kind of reciprocal thing, whether you think of I'm experiencing the universe or the universe is experiencing me. And if you can hover in that kind of in-between, I think that's the state that's being so often described. Thank you.
Okay, why don't you have a seat? Great questions. Thank you, Sue. Do either of you have questions for each other?
Yes, I have a question for you. I wasn't concentrating too hard because I was so nervous, so I may have got this wrong, but I think when you showed the human data on the surge, it was minutes long, and when you showed the rats data, it was fairly short burst.
That's true.
What underlies that difference?
I have no idea. It's a very transient phenomenon that we're seeing in the rat. I mean, we took 30 seconds after the cardiac arrest state where we were able to see this, but it really only lasted for about 20 seconds. And again, you know, I couldn't make the claim that the neurophysiology that we saw really explains this phenomenology, but I think it is an interesting beginning and sort of connecting the dots, especially with this high-frequency surge that's been seen in humans.
Well, from my point of view, it's fantastic because it's helping to bring these two ends together. I've been speculating about there being still activity there, and this is a start towards finding out what it is.
And actually, I just wanted to make one comment that I think is important. You know, we were talking about there are really polarized camps when it comes to the near-death experience. But some of these camps, it doesn't just relate to the origin of the experience, but actually the experience itself. So I've had a number of people who've had near-death experiences who contacted me who felt really validated because a lot of people didn't really believe what they were describing. So it's not just that they don't believe that the brain can do it, they just don't believe it really happened at all. So I thought that was pretty interesting and gratifying that a lot of these individuals were very happy to see some of the science out there that supported the possibility of this.
It's a nice feeling, isn't it, when you feel that you're actually helping people by explaining something. When I was in parapsychology, I used to get so much hate mail, you know, because I was skeptical and so on. But when I was able to explain things like lucid dreams or sleep paralysis, I'd get some nice mail saying, oh, I'm so pleased now, I know I'm not going mad, I know it's got a name, and now people can look it up on Wikipedia and find out more about it. And one of the few things I felt is actually doing some use to people in my weird science.
I want to make a comment. I want to take the devil's advocate position. Actually, the angels.
Stuart, that's very difficult to imagine.
In this case, it's the angel's advocate position, actually. I was in the same BBC show with Sue the day I died in 2002, and they asked me about these near-death, not-out experiences, my experiences as an anesthesiologist, but also working with Roger Penrose. And I said that first, until we understand consciousness in the brain, we can't rule it out of the brain. And here's a plausibility argument that I presented there that I think is still valid, that consciousness normally, right now, is occurring in the neurons, microtubules, space-time geometry between our ears. When the heart stops beating and whatever happens, consciousness goes to a deeper quantum level and can delocalize and become purely quantum in space-time and exist, at least temporarily, independently in space-time geometry out of the body, perhaps, delocalized, but remain entangled as a soul. Now, I'm not claiming proof of that, but I think if there were knockdown proof of an out-of-body experience, that could be a potential explanation. So listening to Sue, I was thinking, how does that differ from the universe being Sue Blackmore or Sue Blackmoring?
Maybe it doesn't, and maybe that kind of explanation will help. But what's come to mind when you were saying that was, well, if that is the case, can you provide from that some answer to this tricky question that somebody over there raised about why the experiences unfold in the way they do? I don't know if this is of an interest to you, but I went on a retreat recently of a completely different kind than I normally do. It was a jhanas retreat, where you learn to enter a series of different states that are described in the early Buddhist literature. And you have to raise up this energy called piti, which is a bit like kundalini, and you get this bizarre kind of heat, and then in the second, that's the first jhana. The second jhana, you calm that down, and you've got a mixture of different things, and then the piti goes away, and third jhana, you've just got this stuff called sukha, which is kind of equanimity and peace. And this is all done through very intensive concentration. And the guy teaching this said he can't prove this, but he thinks that the PT is actually big dopamine surge, which you are learning by this visualization and so on to release. And the dopamine breaks down into noradrenaline and changes the state as you go through these. And that what one is learning is to produce these. And that made me think, how stupid I've been, because the near-death experience, there may well be this kind of a cascade of neurotransmitters. You must know much more than I do, because I'm not a brain scientist, and I want to go and find out more about this. Can there be some kind of a cascade of neurotransmitters which would bring about this order of these experiences? And then we really would be getting somewhere explaining it. Now, if microtubules and non-locality and all of that could begin to give answers to these difficult questions about why the specificity of the near-death experience, then I'd be saying great. But as it is, all I can say is, well, you could be right, but I don't really see how to find out.
Okay, thanks. Who's got a question?
So the one question I had was, has there been any report of near-death experiences in which someone goes through the tunnel and sees a huge fire and then comes back and says, hell is real?
Yes. Not quite like that, no. And the pits of burning sulfur, whatever. I mean, I think in the modern days we don't really know what burning sulfur would be. Oh, I know, it would be like the bus tires, wouldn't it? That's what it smells like in hell. Something like 5% of reported near-death experiences are hellish in quality. They break down into several types. One that is reported to be really horrible but doesn't sound so horrible is going into the void. And it's very, like the tunnel, it has different descriptions, but it's not the dazzling darkness, it's just an absolute horrific nothingness with bright awareness, as it were, not bright, but very aware in nothing and being terrified it's going on forever. That's very common. But there are also this one famous one in which the patient was being taunted with, pitchforks from devils and what have you. And I wish I could remember the name of the drug that they gave him. It's an anti-endorphin drug. But anyway, pardon?
Naloxone.
Thank you, naloxone. And then it suddenly changed the experience, and he kind of woke up, and there were all the doctors leaning over him and poking. So there may be something about the levels of endorphins and other chemicals that makes the difference between the positive and the negative ones. I think one of the really sad things is that within the Christian belief system, people who have hellish experiences can be really disturbed by them afterwards, not just because they were a horrible experience, but because they then, if they're believers, they'll think this means I'm a bad person and I deserve to go to hell and so on, which is one very good reason for trying to find out what the neural basis is and say, no, it's not because you're wicked and bad, it's because at that time you had naloxone or whatever things might have been going on. But the simple answer is yes, but they're pretty varied.
I sometimes tell my patients before going under, if you see a white light, turn around. He's got the mic.
Hello, this is for Sue. When you were talking about how we are dying all the time, you said that we could get used to this fact of becoming all the time and dying all the time, and that we could learn from this not to fear death, perhaps. But obviously in the story, there is a you which persists throughout these various transitory experiences and can, or at least is connected to them in such a way as it is able to learn from the past selves. So my question is, why not call this the self rather than transitory instances of self-consciousness? And also, I'd like to point out that when you die, then this chain of psychological experiences ends, and there is no longer any chance of a future self which has this continuity with your current self, which I think is still a shame.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. Very well put. I would say this, yes, I mean, there is continuity of a body to some extent. Obviously, there's cells dying and replacing and whatever, but there's continuity of structure, there's some continuity of memory and so on, so that these selves will be similar. And you're absolutely right, this chain of similar things will go. But I think, so yes, I'm living this way, I still think, oh, I want to know what's going to happen. I want to know if global warming will destroy the planet, and I won't be here to find out. And, you know, to some extent that's true. But so I'm not rejecting all the senses of self and saying there isn't any self. What I am rejecting is when I sit here feel, oh, here it comes again, because I've gone back into it. Here is me, and there is you out there. That subject of experience is not continuous. That is bitty and comes and goes, and a lot of the time there isn't one at all. And I mention this not so much with respect to near-death experiences, but with the whole of the hard problem and all the things we've been discussing all week, because so often underlying that is there's this thing, consciousness itself, that it's got neural correlates, that it's continuous, and we're trying to explain the continuity, and actually I think there isn't any continuity. So I'm probably plugging it a bit more from that point of view. But thank you for setting the balance back the other way, because I think that's important.
Isn't that like Buddhism, that they're discrete moments? I think they counted 6.5 million in one day, and they're dying, except the Buddhists say they're more conscious in between. You're saying you're not conscious in between.
Well, they would be talking about a different kind of consciousness in between. And then they'll talk about the real self as opposed to the false self, and all sorts of things of that kind.
My question is for Dr. Mashur. Are there cases in which there is complete deactivation for a brief period of time followed by reactivation and that report of a near-death experience? Now I ask this question because if the reports of near-death experience only follow reactivation, or rather only follow a surge, why would there be that surge if it is a preview of a world beyond with no activation?
I'm not sure that I can answer your question. So you're talking about, linking electrical surge and then deactivation with. Yeah, I think the right. I think the problem. Well, there's several problems. First of all, is the monitoring issue. Most people aren't really being monitored with EEG while these experiences happen. And even if somebody was having a cardiac arrest and they're resuscitating, you're not going to have good EEG quality, number one. Number two, in terms of the temporal granularity that you're talking about, at least as far as I know, there hasn't been anything in the literature that really speaks to the kind of granular topic that you're talking about. So I'm sorry, I don't really have a good answer for you.
Can I say something to that one? This is critical in the sense that lots of people claim they were brain dead, they're flatlined while they had the near-death experience. We don't know that. We've got a report given later, sometimes much later. So there are some claims of people reporting a specific event during the resuscitation, like a nurse said some particular thing or whatever. But then, as you said, we haven't got a record of exactly what happened in the resuscitation room. So the problem of tying them up is very difficult. Potentially could be solved by something like having, David Eagleman had the dropping down with a clock watch changing numbers all the time, and they said what the number was, but they're not in a position to do that. So we're way off knowing, tying up the experience someone is having with what is happening in terms of their EEG.
I wanted to ask whether during the surge there's any behavior ever, or it's always completely paralyzed on a rat?
Yeah, great question. Well, I can tell you, at least from the experimental perspective, that there wasn't really any behavior. And again, recall that these animals were anesthetized during the period, so they already had really lost a lot of behavioral expression.
Since Stu mentioned The Day I Died, that was largely the case of Pam Reynolds, an interesting case. She had a deep aneurysm. In fact, it was considered inoperable, but it was determined that there was a surgeon who could operate by chilling her body, stopping the blood flow to her brain, making sure there was no activity. And during that time, she did, in fact, have an out-of-body or near-death experience. And she recalled problems that happened during the surgery. She recalled information about the instruments that were used that even her own referring doctor didn't know. She knew about what was being worn, what the conversation down the hallway. That's one case that I think was fairly veridical. The other was an OBE with Dr. Charles Tart regarding a student that he had who was having sleep problems. She claimed to leave her body during sleep. And he tested her in her sleep laboratory, his sleep laboratory, and she was in fact able to perform the test that he had set up, which was a 5-digit random number above her bed, which I'm sure there's always skeptical arguments, but she was wired, could not have gotten out of her bed, and in fact did in fact get the number, which would be 100,000 to 1 against guessing the number. So that's two cases that I find interesting. I don't know if you want to comment on those.
Do you want to comment on Pam Reynolds? No? Okay, briefly. The Pam Reynolds case is probably the best one we have and relates to the previous question about timing, because it is claimed in that case that she did actually see particular needles on dials and things happening in the resuscitation. But again, we have exactly the same problem. She reported this conversation down the hall, but then people only after the fact went to find out whether this conversation happened. And we all know the psychological mechanisms that go into post hoc agreement and all that sort of thing. It doesn't convince me, although I must say this happened after I stopped doing research on near-death experiences, and I have not done a proper job of investigating it. I did investigate as well as I could ones prior to like the famous shoe on the ledge in Seattle and these other cases, and they just crumble when you try and find any serious corroborative evidence. But I haven't studied that one properly, so I don't know. Charles Tart's experiment was very interesting. It's a very long time ago, 1978, that one, and it was done with the kind of EEG that they had then. And unfortunately, when you look at the EEG record for that case, it goes sort of haywire. It's going along in the normal way it would, and it goes all kind of haywire just at the time when she was reporting the number and, as you said, got it right. This would be consistent with, although it doesn't prove anything, her actually getting out of bed. Also, it is known that she was meant to be observed by one of the research assistants down the corridor, and he had his girlfriend in at that time, and they were in there chatting. Now, these do not disprove it, but it's unfortunate, and it is the only case. Charles Tart did quite a few experiments of that kind, and it's the only one where the number was correctly reported.
The problem with the Pam Reynolds case was that most of what she recalled occurred before they went on fem-fem bypass. So it could have been a case of light anesthesia, awareness under anesthesia, rather than out of body. If she had it truly while she was in hyperthermic arrest, that'd be really stunning. It's unclear that occurred.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Oops, let it out. Okay, I think we better stop there and thank our speakers for a great session. And
thank you.